Welcome, everyone. We are delighted you're here and looking forward to our conversation. We are going to be talking today about developing strategies and capabilities to manage crisis effectively and ensure organizational resilience. We know that this is a really complex topic that has everything to do with things from communication and logistics to supporting people through really traumatic and difficult times. And we have an amazing panel today. We expect a coffee chat with an organic and emergent conversation, which should take us in lots of great direction. So I wonder if we could welcome the others who will be here with us, and we will all introduce ourselves and get started. So maybe what we can do is go ahead and kick it over to you, Natasha. I think you're going to be leading us today. So we are thrilled that you will be taking us in positive directions in terms of our conversation. So let me kick it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tracy. And thank you so much for covering up last minute tech glitches, always unpredictable. Awesome panel with us as always. Welcome to the next episode of November series, Developing Strategies and Capabilities to Manage Crisis Effectively and Ensure Organization Resilience. A quick round of introduction by all the panelists. Dr. Tracy, I believe you would have already introduced yourself. If not, then we can start with you.
Sure, absolutely. I'm glad to do that. So I'm Tracy Brower. I'm the Vice President of Workplace Insight for Steelcase, and I write for Forbes and Fast Company, and I have written a couple of books as well. The most recent is called The Secrets to Happiness at Work. I have a long history working in all aspects of HR, and especially come at this crisis management and resilience conversation from the standpoint of people and process. So looking forward to it with you all as well. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Steve?
Hi, thanks. Hi, Steve Hunt. I am the Chief Expert for Work and Technology for SAP. My background, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. I basically study how to use technology to create more effective work environments. And Tracy, I got a shout out. I've written some books too. My most recent book is a book called Talent Tectonics that looks at how the nature of work is being shaped by technology.
Awesome. Carol?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carol Cooley. I'm Senior Vice President of Human Resources for Pacific Western Bank. I have 20 plus years in all aspects of leading HR and people strategies in primarily growing, highly regulated and organizations undergoing transformation. So this topic is near and dear to my heart, not only how you deal with change, but how you deal with changes that are impacting a lot of employees in very different ways.
Awesome. Elizabeth.
Hi, it's evening here. I'm in Lagos. I have about 20 years working in basically all aspects of HR. Right now, I'm CEO and founder for a business coaching company. I also serve as a fractional chief people officer for Siemens HR. It's a people management technology company. I've spent most of my waking years for the last 15 years trying to manage change and growth and transformation, high growth companies. So I've mostly worked with small and medium enterprise type companies. I coach CEOs as well that are looking to transform their businesses. Yeah. So.
Awesome. Nyazi.
Yeah, hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Ngozi Oke, and I am Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Nextrol, which is a marketing tech company. And there I develop and implement a robust global DEI strategy. Really a lot of my focus is around supporting groups that have been historically marginalized and creating that psychological safety for them, even during times of crisis. I'm also editor of practicalesg.com.
Awesome. This is going to be some very interesting conversations here with the panelists. So my first question, considering we're talking about managing crisis effectively, and last 3 years and 4 years have been quite challenging and daunting for the organizations and other workplace models. So from your experience, what are some of the different types of crisis that organizations and people leaders should be prepared for to respond? So they could be unforeseen and they could be foreseen. Given the lessons that we've learned in last 4 years, what is it that the organizations and the HR leaders are doing something different now to take care of the crisis situation? Question is open to all panelists. Anybody may take the lead and others may follow.
I guess I can go first. I mean, when we were preparing for this, I actually kind of created a list of the different crises that you could have. So I can just kind of read through it. It's like, you know, environmental, like hurricanes and things like that. There's social crisis, like riots and pandemics. I think you could put economic crisis in there. I don't think we usually think of those as crises, but recessions and the impact, I think they should fall into the category of crises, even though I don't think people usually think of them that way. Similarly, like financial crises of like radical downsizing and things like that. There's reputational crises, public reputation. I can think of, you know, companies that suddenly their spokesperson suddenly went totally off the rails. I think we could think of a few companies like that, and it's creating issues. Then, of course, there's safety, physical security, data security is a huge thing. I had a chance to speak at Securitas's global conference once, and I'll tell you, you just leave very afraid after you spend a time with a bunch of data security people. So I think there's a lot of these. And I think the question is, when do they get into occupational health and safety? When do they get into security? And when do they get into HR? I think HR touches all of them. But I think what to me is interesting is sort of that thought of what is a crisis where we'd expect HR to play more of a lead or not. I think some of these are more occupational health and safety, but in some companies, occupational health and safety is part of HR. Some companies, it's not. So,
Yeah, Steve, that's a great introduction, and I would kind of tag on to that and just say I think what the last couple of years, 3-4 years, have shown us is that you need to anticipate crises kind of coming from everywhere. So even if it's not something that rises to the level of impacting your particular organization, I think the one thing that I'm taking away as an HR practitioner is really the world of work is more connected to the rest of the world than ever before. And so even if the crisis doesn't necessarily impact the organization, it may have a direct effect on some of the people in your organization. And for me, I think one of the things that's most important is building that foundation within your organization of communication and trust, so that when people feel like they're impacted by a particular crisis, they feel like they can bring those concerns, questions, and needs that they have forward to the organization.
And
Yeah.
in addition to that, I would like to sort of jump on that bandwagon as well, and sort of illuminate the idea that even if it's not something that maybe makes its way, to global, sort of visibility, or maybe it's not something that impacts our personal identity. It, as you mentioned, Carol, it does. There are incidents of crisis, moments that do impact large groups of our employees in the workplace. And I think that, we've seen some of this in recent years. I think that the murder of George Floyd was just one incident where most people sort of had time to realize, here is something that got visibility that really did impact a lot of people. It impacted a lot of Black people in the workplace, outside of the workplace, and allies as well. But it's important to understand that those incidents happen more often than we know. And because we aren't privy to it, we aren't seeing it. And maybe it doesn't, impact our personal identity. It is still going on and impacting employees on a daily basis.
Yeah, so something I want to add is there's something called the leadership crisis that sort of sneaks up on us. We saw what happened with OpenAI. I can't imagine what a day at the office after the announcements would have been, and then crazy weekend. Now, who's responsible for that? At the end of the day, when you have a leadership crisis, who steps up? Has to be HR. Someone has to. And when we're interconnected Carol said something like that. So it's happening in one company, but the rest of the world is along for the ride, and it can't be transferred crisis at the end of the day. So people are wondering, what's happening at OpenAI? Should we be scared? You know, what were the doubts from the board that made them, all those kinds of questions. Yeah. So I think it's an important topic.
Yeah, and I always like to fall back on kind of models as a starting point. Like, how do we think about the models that guide us in thinking about how to work through things, right? So there's so many things to talk about, from people and supporting them and psychological safety and how we respond in terms of communication and leadership. We can obviously unpack all that, but I especially appreciate, Steve, the list that you gave us. I think those are they make so much sense, and they overlap each other as well. And another model that I really like, that I think is helpful, is to think about kind of a 2x2. Any good sociologist can create a 2x2. But I think it's been really helpful with organizations I've worked with in the past to think about, like, what's the likelihood of something happening? And then what's the potential negative implication of that thing happening? And it may be something that's extraordinarily unlikely, but the implication for risk and danger and negative downside is very, very high. So we would put more effort into proactively planning for that thing. Or it might be a high likelihood and a lower risk. That too, we might want to put more planning into, because it's a high likelihood, and we'll probably need to work on it. There's a wonderful saying in the armed forces that no plan of action survives the first contact with the enemy. But the planning and the proactivity have huge benefits for us, because we've been able to think things through. So I really like that model of likelihood and then risk as we consider what might be happening with our organizations. And I also really, really like kind of some P's for us to think about. So we want to think about, like, how do we potentially prevent something? How do we potentially plan for something? How do we create a proactive approach to a practice that will allow us to respond? And then how do we think about performing through the crisis as well? But for me, one of the first things is to be really planful, and to think about not just how might we react, but how might we actually prevent something. And some things are seen, as you mentioned, Natasha, right? Some things are seen, some things we can't predict, but to the extent that we can imagine, that actually helps us to be planful and to respond effectively when something does happen.
Yeah, I think if I could build on some of the stuff you're saying, Tracy, because I think there's one, I think you do have to define crises into, there's at least two main and time bound. There's, like, a hurricane is an event in time. We have to deal with it. It's very well defined. Whereas then you have, like, simmering ongoing crisis. The pandemic certainly fell into that. It was a crisis that took it lasted and lasted. It's still going on, and I think that what's interesting as you're talking, Tracy, is there's a lot of focus on physical safety and physical security when you think about crises. And there's some fascinating things. Like, I remember one of our customers was a food service company, and when the pandemic hit, they said, we treated it like a whole thing about food. We have foodborne illness drills, and so we had a whole process, and we just repurposed what we did in that aspect for dealing with a pandemic. And I thought, wow, that they were ahead of a lot of other companies on dealing with the physical, tangible aspects of the crises. But the psychological side, so we focus a lot on physical safety, but the psychological safety, which is what when you have a crisis that just sort of simmers. And Ngozi, I said your name right. When you talked about George Floyd and the riots and things going on, that went on and on. And it was like, when is this going to stop? And is it going to stop? And that's a different kind of crisis. And I think we haven't really focused on a company to say, how do we deal with just that thing that never stops, that you're constantly anxious about? Like, at any moment, riots could erupt in the streets. And that, which it makes me sad to think we have to think of a world like that. But I think that's something that we really haven't thought, because it definitely affects, employee well-being, engagement, creativity, and it's very different than most crisis management.
Yeah, it's sort of the difference between chronic crisis, it goes on and painful over time, or something that's more episodic. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is the shifting roles that organizations are playing. Like, one of the things we know is that in some cases, political figures or countries or community organizations are degraded in terms of the extent to which people trust them, and companies, organizations are actually increasing in the amount of trust that people are putting in them. So you think about the role of an organization and how that's shifting. Like, I was working with an oil and gas organization, and they had a hurricane in their region, and they opened all of their facilities to people to come and sleep and shower. They had showering facilities as well. Because they had lost their homes. And so the organization opened its doors to people for that physical need that they were serving. But in the process, love your point, Steve, they were serving that emotional need and that psychological need. Like, oh my gosh, somebody cares, somebody sees this issue. They offered mental health and crisis counseling in the process. And gosh, people could get a meal and they could get a shower as well. So I love those points, but I know others will weigh in as well.
There was a time when it was fashionable or, respectable for companies to stay neutral in times of crisis, but not anymore. The workforce in general is expecting some form of responsibility, like it's demanded. So if you I used to work in a company where there would be riots in the streets and we couldn't talk about it. We couldn't declare we couldn't. And the head of marketing would come and say, Elizabeth, I was head of HR. I said, Elizabeth, wait, what do we do? Our team members are talking about it. And we're like, well, our policy is to stay neutral. I knew that something, at the end of the day, in that particular scenario, companies were being called out on Twitter for staying silent. If you were silent, you were complicit, and they will come for you. So it is actually very imperative that companies take the forefront. The people who have the means are working in organizations. People who contribute to the economy work in organizations. So organizations sort of have to play Big Brother at some point, whether we want to do it or not. Someone has to lead the charge. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of, it's not always crises that you plan for. It's crises that happen and you don't know what to do. I think the psychological safety aspect of it can be overemphasized. You even have to expand that net, probably to people outside your organization. You have to have conversations like these. You have to reach out and, just ask. During the pandemic, we were in lockdown for about 9 months. And we didn't know what to do. Many companies didn't know what to do. It's a new reality. We were on WhatsApp group chats, creating also asking people, what are you doing? You have to lay off. Are you laying off people? But confidential information, some people keep it close to their chest, but you need guidance. You have new people in the profession just trying to figure it out. Leadership crises have happening in there. So I think the conversations need to happen. If you know stuff or you're figuring out stuff, reach out, support. I think that's how we can help in this. Well, I'll stop here.
Awesome. I think this is giving space to a next follow-up question in terms of how do we see the strategies now being changed in communities and allyship, or shall I say, in terms of the marginalized groups that some organizations or most of the organizations have. And from the DEI strategy, how do we see this particular impact of crisis, changing the whole outlook and again, developing the capabilities for these communities and allyships in the organizations. Have you seen any trends? Have you experienced any differences in the way the leadership is looking at this and the way HR leaders are addressing it now?
I can start this one off. So in the DEI space, in moments of crisis, especially events that sort of disproportionately impact historically marginalized groups, people of color, the LGBTQ community. There are sort of a few approaches that I've seen, and I guess I'll break it maybe down into three categories. One is really around a bit of what Elizabeth was actually talking about, which is sort of like the public facing sort of statements of support, which is one thing that I think in the last few years companies have really had to wrestle with, because silence has really not resonated well with employees and it's tended to backlash. But also sometimes initially at the onset of a crisis, organizations don't have all the information, or they are still trying to figure out where they do stand. And so also rushing and saying something, anything, also tends to backlash. And so I think organizations recently have really trying to really ground what it is that they believe in and what it is that they plan to say when crisis happens. And so I've seen organizations really build out frameworks, actually, sort of in anticipation of the next crisis, so that there's a matrix of, okay, well, does it, align with our business model? Does it align with this? And then that means that we say this in particular, or we don't say this. And so I've seen that sort of built out in terms of public facing communication, or public facing sort of, communication of support. And then there's sort of the internal support systems that I've seen also put in place, which tend to be sort of like training managers around having conversations, check-in conversations with their team members, with their employees, which tends to be, questions around, well, how are you doing? How are you feeling? The challenge with those sorts of questions is that managers are often ill-positioned or ill-equipped to actually ask those questions and then to respond in those conversations, right? And so, if there's someone that is from a historically marginalized group, there's been a crisis, they're not feeling psychologically safe. The question of how are you feeling? They might not feel safe enough to actually honestly answer that question. And maybe if they do, that manager is not well positioned enough to know what to say, right? They can actually do more damage in that conversation than good. And so, that's sort of a space where I've seen actually employee resource groups really play a role in creating spaces, sort of protected spaces for people who identify with a particular group, to create that safe space and talk about a particular topic. And I think that that's important to sort of protect those spaces. And then another approach has been really around benefits. And really thinking about how benefits programs can be expanded to really support mental health. And so, there's a couple of different options out there. I've got the most experience with Modern Health, and so they offer, one-on-one therapy. They offer one-on-one professional coaching, financial coaching with employees. And so, the employee doesn't have to go to their employer. They don't really have to go through the runaround of EAP, which I know is an additional resource, but that often goes underutilized. And so really thinking about the resources that you can connect with to provide another outlet and one-on-one protected, safe, support sort of option for employees, I think is another way that I've seen companies exploring these days.
Yeah, Ngozi, that's a great segue into, some of the things I was thinking about in my organization. You mentioned the kind of the speed of communication, and I think people are very used to wanting a response right away. And when Roe versus Wade was overturned, I remember getting a lot of pressure from some folks in our organization. Take a stand. How's the company going to respond? What are we going to do? And to your point that you made a minute ago, we didn't have all the answers. We didn't know how our benefits plans were going to align with those that were going to seek, women's health care, or if our plans would allow, for example, for travel to other states to receive that health care. So we had to do some really research on the back end before we could come out. But I think the modern expectation is that you have an answer right away. And we had to balance that with having the right information to be able to share with our employee population groups. And, as you mentioned, it's a really great segue, because we leveraged our women's ERG group to help us kind of temper the expectation around that communication and help us get the messages out once we were ready and prepared to release that information to our employee population. So real life examples of exactly what you just described.
If I could build on this a little, because Ngozi, what you said, and Elizabeth, it also kind of goes to you said about training leaders on this crisis. I think, this idea of we have physical security drills that we do with companies. If this happens, fire drills, security drills, but we don't focus on psychological safety drills. And you could almost, I think, there's a lot of research on something called supportive supervisory behavior, and a lot of the reasons why supervisors, they don't know what to do. They aren't trained, and you don't want them trying to act like psychologists, but there is stuff they can do. And Ngozi, as you pointed out, there's a right way and a wrong way. And so I think a lot of people, when you're dealing with crises, particularly that are tied to what I might call emotional anxiety, I think a lot of people shut down for fear of, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So I think there definitely could be a whole focus on psychological safety training. Usually we think of that in the terms of development and coaching, but you could also look at it in the terms of helping people deal with traumatic, emotionally driven situations. Because I think I think a lot of people, it's actually easier for people than they realize. They don't realize you don't have to fix the problem. It's really getting good at listening and open dialogue and showing empathy. I do wonder too, if we should do more training on employees too. I've always talked about this. Like, I've always been struck how few companies train employees on how to receive feedback. There is a right and a wrong way to receive feedback. We do all this training on managers on how to give feedback. Well, it's the same thing with crises. I think one of the things that companies struggle with is when something happens, I think that there is it's sort of a thought about the company sort of saying, this is what we can and cannot do. Like Elizabeth, your comment about the company saying nothing wasn't right, but also they can't necessarily take a political stand, or sometimes they can. And like SAP is a good example. SAP, I think we're in like 40 countries. And I remember some meeting once, and we're a very strong, supportive organization. Our culture is very inclusive, and we are recognized for it. But I remember sitting where the head of our DEI had a chart that showed LGBTQ rights in all the countries he operated, and it went from protected to capital punishment. And it was striking emotionally. But that's something people don't necessarily realize, that companies operate in a broader context that often does not ascribe to their own internal values, but they have to live within it, particularly global organizations.
Spot on, Steve. So I was going to talk about when you're booking a flight, let me use this analogy, and you're selecting your seats, and you find yourself for leg room, you're picking the exit aisle, and there's a warning that comes up. You have to be willing to support in times of, if there's a crisis. And when you're on board, the air hostess will come to you, and give you the coach. Are you willing, first of all? But then they have to check if you're able. So to tie into what Tracy, Carol, and Steve have said, we find that people are willing to respond in terms of crisis, but they don't typically know how. And it's not just, but the people, like Steve says, who are who are living through it. Because first of all, the leader's living through it first. So he might have, or she might have an emotional response. And in that emotional state, it might be silence or the wrong question, or just silently freaking out. But when we have to act, like if the plane is crashing and we have to forcefully land on water, on that exit door. If you're sitting there, whether you're the passenger or you're the pilot, whoever you are, you have to be able to do it. I think we need to do a little bit more of having conversations. They sometimes are considered taboo in some cultures, what Steve talked about now about the LGBT. Well,
I can jump in. It looks like Elizabeth is having difficulties. Gosh, technology is not always our friend, is it? I think a lot of us have faced that today. But one of the things I think is so critical in this, and bridging on what you all have talked about as well, is just communication and the cadence of communication. There was some beautiful research that during the pandemic, the popularity of podcasts went crazy. And the theory was, from a sociological and a psychological point of view, that we were craving the sound of the human voice, that we wanted to be in touch with each other, and that was our instinct. And so this idea of communicating regularly, communicating frequently, sometimes people just want to know that you're working on it, that you've heard it, that you're paying attention. You don't have the answers yet, but these are the questions you're asking, and these are the directions that you want to go, and these are the values that will guide the decisions. I think those all make a really big difference. And I think the other thing we can do is think about not just telling, but also asking. And I think this builds on the comments that you were making about DEI, right? Like, everybody will be receiving information differently. People may have different types of responses in terms of their own emotions, their own senses of safety and threat, depending on the situation. And so when we create forums, not just to share, but also to ask and to listen, not necessarily because we are going to fix something, so leaders don't have to be social workers, but just asking the question and letting people know that they are seen is a big deal. So that frequency of communication. And the last thing I would say is that values within an organization are such a true north, I think. Like, communication can become very fragmented. Leaders and HR and lots of different parts of the business are doing their best, and they're on the front lines, and they have to answer the question right now. But when we have really, really strong cultures, when we're really clear about our values, I think that can help, right? It can't help us manage the minutia. It won't answer the detailed question, but it can give us a true north and a sense of direction in terms of how we anticipate working through the crisis together, no matter what that might be.
Mm-hmm.
I actually really love that. I do think that we're in a time now where we're needing companies and leaders to lean with vulnerability a bit more, right? And I think that sort of gone are the days when we expect companies where we need companies and company leaders to emote sort of like perfection and flawlessness. And I think that if we're asking employees to be vulnerable, to let us know what they need for psychological safety, to build that, to show up imperfect and impacted by crises, right? Because that's the human condition. Then I think too, it's okay to show up and say, yeah, we're still trying to figure out what our response is, but we know this has impacted, our employee base. And so we are working on it, right? We're asking these questions. And so I really like what you mentioned, Dr. Tracy, around, sort of showing up that way a little bit more. This is particularly sort of important for me because in the DEI space, that is my ask of leaders actually, is to show up vulnerable and show up imperfect, because otherwise we show up silent and we don't do anything, because in the DEI space, everybody is afraid of doing and saying the wrong thing. And in order to try to not make a mistake, we do nothing. And that is the worst thing you can do, right? And so it's about being vulnerable, taking risks, doing the things, knowing that we'll make mistakes, but learning from it, apologizing, and then, doing better. And so I think that as an organizational journey, I think that is sort of a good thing to lean into, because it also, I think, empowers our leaders to lean more in that space as well, and to sort of bring that human aspect a little bit more to the workplace.
Interesting. Steve, I think somebody from the audience has a question for you, and they would love to know more about the psychological safety drill in terms of what can be covered under this, and how do they ensure it's applicable and there's continuity in implementation, which is more sustainable for the organization.
Yeah, I'm happy, and I'm as a panelist, I literally just came up with that concept of a psychological safety drill, which is why I love these sort of interactions because you get great ideas. But I guess what I'd look at it is to start by defining, that there's different kinds of crises, but some of these are crises of anxiety and concern, as opposed to like, if it's a physical crisis, what people need is confidence and clarity and direction. But when it is a more simmering anxiety, fear, what they need is, probably there was research actually during the Qualtrics did during the pandemic that belonging is probably one of the most important things. They need to feel a sense of care and support and belonging, of which listening is a big part. I think we saw a lot of this happen sort of over time in companies. And Tracy, I remember with the listening when talking, I talked to lots of HR leaders and they were saying, yeah, our leaders started listening to their employees. Shouldn't they have always have been doing that? But you get listening fatigue. But I think what I put into a psychological safety drill is talking about the different kinds of crises, talk about the emotional states that are people in. All of us have experienced these. I think Ngozi, I don't know if you've seen the research on allyship and inclusion, but they said one of the most effective things on DEI is don't frame it about other groups. Everyone will experience exclusion and bias at some point in your life. As a colleague of mine said, if you don't think you're going to be discriminated against, you must not think you're ever going to get old. It's so framing it so people have an understanding of what it feels like, because we all have that in some way. And then going through some exercises on what to do, what not to do in terms of empathetic listening. And I think the last one on the values, I think, Tracy, I totally agree that the clarity on your values on these, but a discussion about how these manifest, because values, it's easy to display your values when nothing's challenging them. And I remember I worked for Starbucks years ago, and they did a great onboarding where they talked about their values, and they said they created conflicts. They say sometimes there's conflicts between our values. One is a commitment to profitability for our shareholders. Another one is, sustainability. And they talked about the tensions that exist between these. And I thought that was a really interesting talking about these things in a calm state, so that when it happens in sort of a hot state, you can get into it. So just some ideas, but I would really love to hear the panelists. If you were to put together a psychological safety drill, what would you put into it?
I think I'll put difficult questions, really, like the one you just asked, but well, on a serious note. I'll put the questions about the topics that don't trend, because you know how we learn as human beings. We learn by actually doing stuff. So is it the topics that people really are afraid to talk about, but exist? I would maybe set a team and ask for ideas, like focus group from across the company, cross section of members of the business, and ask them what kinds of questions should go into a psychology safety drill. But I would be leaning towards the more difficult questions, because that's how we would learn faster. When it's a crisis, it's not something that's fun, and it's usually not something we expect. So I would take the tables a few times and try to put the topics that we would be scared of responding, something that the head of marketing would come to ask if we should respond to, things like that. And then we could train people on how to respond. What we did in different times, we've had we've had a fair share of unrest in Nigeria. And what we eventually had to do was, and we had leadership crisis, is why I keep talking about because sometimes when you're having leadership crisis, you can append things. If you have a good leader and you're in a hurricane, you can you can make decisions, but when the leader is in crisis, it's a different conversation. Mm-hmm. We had to have conversations and put down things of, these are the things, no matter what's happening, these are the things we will not say. And these are the people that can answer. So even if a reporter calls you and talks to you, You have to say, if you want to keep working here, you have to follow our script. We will not be talking about this. Call this person. Because if you fob them off and you tell them, no comment, no, they'll keep reaching out. So we agreed and gave a phone number. This is the person to contact. And then they contact and we know how to handle. So in those types of things, I think maybe thinking about the worst, thinking about what's the worst that can happen and get your head around how to deal with it, typically might not be as bad as that. It's how, like, we're people professionals, whatever, 70, 20, 10, 80, 10, 80, 20, whatever, all those models. Yeah, that's how we learn. I'd throw people in the deep end with that and see what comes out.
Yeah, Elizabeth, that's a really great point. I like the planning for it, and having responses and being prepared is something I think we've all talked about. One of the things that is kind of a step before that for me, and I think we've all talked about this a little bit too, is not making assumptions. So, if I'm thinking about a psychological safety drill, I don't want to be the one making assumptions about what's going to impact people's psychological safety. I want to be in a position to be able to ask those questions, get some responses, get some information about what are those things that may be impacting individuals in the organization, so that we can then be planful and help prepare for what the responses, if any, the company may have to that. So again, I think one of the things that I learned specifically from the pandemic is, people are going to react differently and come from their own points of view, and making sure that you're not making assumptions and being as inclusive as you can in your crisis response is really one way that you can help the organization be more resilient by catering to a large variety of different needs within the organization.
Yeah, that makes so much sense in terms of being resilient as an organization. And when we have resilient people, we can be more resilient organizationally as well. The thing that I think is really interesting is the concept of a drill is really the concept of preparedness, right? Like, we've been through the tough thing. And so then when we go through the real tough thing, it doesn't feel quite so foreign or quite so uncertain. And I think one of the things we can do is create great systems ahead of time that will help us when we get to those difficult situations. So well-being is a great example. Like, in what ways do we create processes and programs that address people's well-being, from benefits and policies and practices to affinity groups to leaders who are developed over time and can support people's well-being, to flexibility when we're able to offer that. When we have those solid approaches to well-being in situations that aren't difficult, then when we get to the difficult situations, we can fall back in some of those frameworks. I think another couple of things that are helpful as we're thinking about being proactive is stakeholder analysis. Like, really thinking about who are the people who might be affected differently in the different kinds of crises that may come up, so we can be really specific about the needs and not sort of just spreading peanut butter, right? Doing the same thing for everybody isn't always very helpful. So how can we do a stakeholder analysis? Who are the people who are highly affected? Who are less affected? Who are the people who may need different kinds of support? And the third thing I would say is I think it's also really helpful to get very clear about roles, so that when we get to a difficult point, we know who we're going to count on and who we're going to go to. We're not starting with a blank page and saying, okay, who's on first and who's going to do what, right? There'll be some of that because every situation is different. That's the nature of crisis. But when we're really clear about it, that's helpful as well. I gave the example of the oil and gas company that was supporting people through a hurricane. And their facilities team is actually the group that took the lead on that, because they had the lead for the support systems that were part of that. Another really interesting example, I was working with M&M Mars years ago. There was a really inappropriate statement that was made about Skittles, how people were like Skittles. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it was a huge sort of, the internet blew up about that at the time. And so M&M Mars was in a situation, they owned Skittles. Skittles was one of the brands, to like respond and to say the right thing and to do that quickly. And there was great clarity about roles in PR, roles in social media, roles in people services. And so it was easy to coordinate quickly because of the clarity about roles. So I think all of those things help us to be resilient when we can look ahead, when we can understand what's going on, when we can plan for things, and then when we're able to respond based on that clarity.
Awesome. Considering we are almost inching close to the end of the panel conversation, I would love to spend the next 10 minutes or so with the panel on my last question. How do we see technology being leveraged by the business leaders and the HR leaders in this whole concept of organization resilience, managing crisis, building capabilities, designing strategies, considering that we've spoken of a good amount of element of the human aspect of this and how the impact is majorly on the human aspect and less on the process aspect. Again, question is open to all panelists. Anybody may take the lead.
I mean, I work for a technology company, and that's a lot of my work is, working with companies that are asking questions. Like I remember I was asked, somebody once, how do you do a comp review during a pandemic? I remember that one question in particular. So I think there's a lot of applications of technology. I mean, and I kind of would put them into one, there's in the moment technology, like employee listening technology. There's a lot of technology that either directly by asking questions, or you can look at patterns in data, whether it's interactions, how people are interacting with each other. And you want to be very transparent, because you don't want to be creepy about it, that people are, but we're sort of monitoring the situation. So, and recognizing that leaders, one of our customers shared this with me, leaders can't actually truly listen to employees without technology, in the sense that if you're a senior executive, you kind of live in a bubble, whether or not you want to or not. You need to figure some other way to get messages from the floor, because they're not necessarily going to walk up to you and give them their honest feeling, kind of Ngozi, as you're talking about. So finding about how do we get listening, there's a lot of technologies there. The other one that I think I want to call out, which is often overlooked, is technology that enables more flexible job design. That if control over one's schedule, the ability to work remotely, these things where if somebody is dealing with a personal crisis, they want flexibility to adapt to it, to deal with what they're going on. And I think a lot of these things too, when we talk about crises, we tend to think of them as large social crises. But, if you have an injured child, there's a lot of things that are very personal crises too, that you're going through the same emotional state, but it just affects your small world as opposed to the larger world. And in some ways that might be harder because people don't know what you're going through. And I think technology there that enables people with more flexibility and control over their schedule, over their work location, as well as benefits that deal with some of these things that say, if you need this, we have this for you. I think that's what I would really focus on. I think we tend not to think about how big an impact the design of the job itself has on crisis management.
Yeah, I think the fundamental thing is to provide systems that allow people to have greater choice and control and autonomy. Like one of the things that happens in crisis, whether it's personal or social or organizational, is that you feel really out of control, and feeling out of control goes along with challenges in terms of all kinds of mental health issues. And so when we can reintroduce, reinforce, support, create the conditions for choice, control, autonomy, that's a big deal. And tech can help us do that, right? Like where I'm working or how I'm working or the hours that I'm working, if I'm able to be asynchronous in my team. I think the other thing tech can do for us is really provide quicker response, really provide scale in terms of communication. We were talking previously about how critical it is that people just hear regular updates, even if there isn't a lot of substance to those updates. And so tech can be empowering for people in terms of making their own choices. It can be supportive for people in terms of the way that we scale, the way the organization will support them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dr. Tracy. I think one example that we've used to potentially provide employees additional choice throughout the pandemic is with a notification system. You know, we notify employees across the organization when we've had positive cases in a particular office. And that gives our employees the ability to say, okay, do I really want to come into the office, or do I need to make a different personal decision and work from home? And that's a very small example of being able to provide some of that choice to employees. The other thing that I've seen that we've talked a lot about during this panel is being more proactive. One of the systems and technologies that we have in place is now an early alert system, and it will help us, because we have a nationwide presence, identify potential for storms, for wildfires, snow events, other types of natural disaster types of things, or unrest and political situations in the locations that we are based in. And that helps us be a little bit more predictive of what are some of those things that could potentially impact some of our locations. So again, that's another use of technology and more of that planful mode that we've talked about today.
Spot on, Carol. So the big thing that was, we've talked about, Dr. Tracy, Steve, have talked about how it's helped communication, like in whatever form, and also flexibility. So there's a crisis, you don't have to be in the streets. And I was just thinking about, yeah, we have to plan. Data about previous crisis, future, we can predict. So predictive analysis can also be applied, and it's just what Carol said. I think technology is the biggest game changer, and we can convert it to whatever we want to use it for. Even for, I think even with AI, I was going to try to figure out about this psychological safety drill and if that can become a thing. But hey, we have AI. So it's one thing thinking forward, it can actually become a thing. So I think that's one thing that technology can help us do.
I second all of that. I don't have much additional to add because all of this has been very valuable. I do agree that technology just expands our optionality for ways that we can cope and ways that we can help our employee base to sort of cope in times of crisis.
Nazi, I have something to add, and I think you'll be able to bring in some insights. If we were to bring the allies and the communities together through technology, how do you see those benefiting in the times of crisis and building resilience throughout?
Can you ask that question again?
Sure. If we were to leverage technology for the allies, tribes, and the marginalized communities, how do you see technology supporting them during crisis and helping them build resilience in the organization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the thing sort of that comes to mind for how folks who are part of historically marginalized groups and allies can sort of perhaps support one another through technology, sounds like is the question. Well, I'd say, one, it actually breaks geographical barriers that are currently present. So I think one thing that it kind of does, that technology does off the bat, is sort of break those physical boundaries, and it allows us all to be in the same virtual place together. And I think that in that space, then we can become empowered to trade ideas, to learn from one another, to encourage and empower one another to talk about what it is that we need, you know, as someone who might be disproportionately impacted by a crisis. What is it that I'm feeling, experiencing? What is it that I need? And as an ally, to hear that and understand that, I think that there's a lot of great communicating and idea sort of generating and growth that can happen in that space. I'd love to hear what others have to say about it.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was a tough question. So you're a brave one. But yeah, I think you got it. Just basically creating online communities. I think we can leverage that a lot and bridge the gap. Doesn't matter location, but if there's anything that's an affinity, we can create an online community and people can share experiences. I've benefited from online communities quite a bit.
Yeah.
Going through personal crisis myself.
No, I think that's true. And we've seen that in companies with our technology, that when you start creating forums and people are able to find each other and find similarities. The other thing that's interesting is that people are often more comfortable expressing in different ways things. I think on the other side, though, on this, it's also an important thing about why we need to focus on getting people together in person too. That the issue that I think we're really facing with the move to hybrid remote work is it's not about returning to offices. I don't get it. It's more, if you choose to say we should give people flexibility, which you should, to a point. And it is important to meet in person. I think what companies haven't figured out and employees haven't figured out, that when we meet in person, and there's psychological research on this, it changes our connection. I don't know if I joke. I don't know if we smell each other. There's something that happens, and there are certain conversations and decisions, and it's the reason I use the example. It's like why it's important to, for example, meet with your family or friends in person every so often. It's just important. And so I think on the use of technology, part of it is, don't lose the fact that part of this is we should use technology to create strong human connections. And part of a strong human connection is a face-to-face interaction. I don't think you can get around it.
Agreed. I think that's how we're designed that way to need it. Yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
Any more last thoughts before we wrap up?
Actually, a quick thought did come to mind, I think, in response to your last question too, around sort of technology supporting our mission for addressing crisis in the workplace. One of the great benefits that I am seeing is actually the access to mental health resources virtually, and how that has really been helpful globally for employees in general, just having access to that when employers provide that. But for historically marginalized groups, access to mental health resources is something that has been historically stigmatized, and for a variety of reasons is not something that really is always embraced or is always accessible to different groups, like to people of color, for example. And so I love that I'm seeing an increase in companies offering this, because, as I'm speaking with my colleagues, and I'm speaking with, just different communities of color, I'm hearing that they are utilizing these services in ways that they otherwise would not have. And so to me, this is amazing to see companies actually be instrumental in sort of dismantling some systemic issues, right, when it comes to access to mental health. And so that's something that came to mind. I wanted to put that on the table because that's been amazing to see.
Awesome. This brings us to a brilliant end to our series for November. Thank you so much, everyone. Great conversation, great ideas, great concepts. And I hope you enjoyed your panel discussions as much as we did. Signing off, there's next panel coming up. See you again. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are glad to be with you today. I am Lauren Lefkowitz. I'm today's panel moderator. I'm an executive coach who works with workaholic executive and emerging executive women to help them figure out how to escape the trap of being fine. And I am super excited about today's panel, which is about making things better for your teams and your companies. So welcome to today's panel, Connecting the Dots Between Hybrid and Remote Work with Business Productivity, Performance, and a Culture of Belonging. I would love to welcome our panelists on the stage. And as they're joining us, I encourage you to comment as we're going along, ask questions, join in the conversation, and also get to know each other. This is a place for communicating and connecting. So connect to your panelists and me, connect to each other as your comments resonate with each other. And let's get started. Welcome, panelists. I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourself. We'll go with Tracy, then Anu, then Chris. And if you could introduce yourself, tell us where you work and what you do, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Sounds good. Thanks. Looking forward to it, you all. I'm Tracy Brower. I'm the Vice President of Workplace Insight for Steelcase. My PhD is in the area of the sociology of work, how we affect our work, how it affects us. I write for Forbes and Fast Company, and I've written a couple of books as well. My most recent book is called The Secrets to Happiness at Work, and have been researching this topic deeply. This is such a moment to really come together around this topic. So looking forward to our conversation, you all.
Wonderful. Thank you. So glad to be here. My name is Anu Mandapati, and I'm the Global Head of Culture and Inclusion at Magic Leap, which is an augmented reality tech company.
Hi, I'm Chris Deaver. I'm excited to be here. I'm co-founder of BraveCore, executive coach, culture shaper. We work with Fortune 500s and just companies in general looking to take their culture to the next level. I co-authored a book called Brave Together. I right with Fast Company, Wall Street Journal, and really excited to be part of this conversation and dive into the future of HR in this space.
Terrific. So glad to be with all of you. You're all already doing it, but panelists, if you could mute when you're not talking so that we don't get background noise, that would be great. And we're a group of a size where we can just jump in and give answers. So everybody has an opportunity to respond, continue the conversation, and we'll dive in and get started. So let's just start with the shift in culture that we've seen over the past several years, with the shift from remote and hybrid work being an exception to then the rule, to maybe becoming an exception again. So what have you all seen in your workplaces or with people you've interacted with? In what way has hybrid and remote work affected culture inside of companies?
I can start. I think it's affected culture significantly. And I guess starting out, my bias is that I think hybrid work, remote work is here to stay. I think we had kind of a pendulum shift toward lots and lots and lots of hybrid and remote and lots of pushback. And then I think the pendulum will come back to center a bit. I don't think we're ever going back to a world of 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, everybody in the office. So I really believe that hybrid will be the future. And I think that culture has really, really played a role. Like, we experience culture frequently based on being with each other. We can do that remotely, on camera and with technology, mitigating that experience. But culture is also significantly informed by our work together, our nonverbals that we share, the norms that we reinforce with each other, the assumptions that we make, the behaviors that we see. And so proximity is really important to our understanding of culture, whether that proximity is on camera or whether that proximity is face-to-face. But we also understand culture significantly based on the individual people we interact with. And when you're face to face, you can see the person across the work cafe, you can see the person across the office, you get to interact with more people more of the time who you wouldn't normally get to interact with. And so one of the challenges being remote or being hybrid is that we may become fragmented because we're only interacting with who we're interacting with, right? Like, I'm interacting with my individual customers, I'm interacting with my team, I'm interacting with those few people. That's one. I think another is that there was a great a colleague who said, when we all went home, we couldn't hear the birds chirping anymore, right? Like, it's just a nice analogy for how we tend to listen to each other. We run into somebody in the elevator lobby. We see somebody at the, drinking fountain, whatever. We bring those ideas into our next meeting. And when we don't have that interstitial, that in-between orientation to each other, sometimes we may not get the same cues. And so we may have a void in culture. And the other thing to think about here is the number of people who were hired during the pandemic who have never met their teammates in person, right? Like, it's not that we have a misunderstanding about our culture. We may have a lack of understanding about our culture. So voids are another thing. And then the last thing I would say is that I think culture has also sort of become stagnant in some ways. Like, we build culture through those regular habits, those regular routines, those regular interactions, those regular sort of ways of coming together, which may seem like the minutia. We did the wine and cheese or the iced tea and cheese. We did the bagpipe playing. We did the, adopt a pet event. And those seem super detaily, but they ladder up to strategies that support us in terms of knowing each other, seeing each other, coming together, collaborating, and being able to innovate together. And so culture has also become stagnant in some places because we haven't been able to refresh and renew and remind ourselves about culture through things like that. So those are the three that I would point to: is fragmentation, voids, and stagnancy.
Yeah, I think there's been a major shift, right? Tracy talked a lot about it. It's pretty existential, right? For a lot of people, I think just in terms of behavior shift, right? We're not going back. When human behavior shifts this dramatically, it just doesn't go back. And we also have a generation, rising generation of leaders and aspiring leaders that are not just digital natives, but they operate in this way. I mean, my kids' generation, they're on the phone, regularly with their friends, and they're doing team type. Well, usually it's gaming, but they're spending a lot of time connecting in those ways, and they're very comfortable. And I think the other thing is that we brought our work home with us, literally, and so our expectations for what work is are much higher in the sense that it's work has to fit into our lives and not the other way around. I think that was something that has significantly shifted, and we see it in. We just saw that the word of the year was nominated by Webster, authenticity, this last year. And so people want that in their work, but they also want that in their culture, right? And what they feel at work. And they want to see that in their leaders. They don't want the pretense or the smoke and mirrors of exec presence. They want real connection, to their team and to their leaders. And the other thing is, I think that we've seen, this was just highlighting in the Gallup data that just, told us that people are unhappier than ever in their work. And, we ask, why is that? Well, I think it's this disconnect, but it's the power struggle that, companies are flexing now, right? Wasn't it just 8 or 12 months, 12 months ago, we were talking about the great resignation, all the employees had all the power. And now it's, employers that are flexing and saying, well, return to work. And, they're doing layoffs and all these things, which frankly is just a swing of the pendulum. And, 8 to 12 months from now, we'll probably see the power be back in employees. And it's just how the market works. But I think people are exhausted and tired of that game, right? So I think what we're seeing is, I wouldn't say the guillotines are out, but the revolution of, what people are feeling and what they want in their culture. And you see a convergence of these generations that are builders, right? They're used to Minecraft and, just coming together and solving, crazy challenges. And I look at some of these games or things, and I think, people are really spending their time doing it. It's like, wow. But in a culture, I think people are ready, to build together in ways that they have not before, and not just be brave alone in silos, but be brave together in co-creative ways that really cuts through all the bureaucracy that we've had to deal with for so long. And even just the notion of being an employee. I think there's so much, and we look at performance management, for example, leaders, managers frankly, this has been kind of an excuse for abuse or approach that has pushed people to some extremes, or at least to feel burned out as to that relationship, right? If the relationship with a manager is not inspiring whatsoever, it's like, why would people want to be part of that? So we see, them leaning into entrepreneurship, 70 to 80% of folks are doing some kind of side job because they're trying to tap into their passion that they're not finding in their work. But I think for us resides the question with leaders and teams and cultures is how can we tap into that, right? And the great companies are doing this, right? I've seen it in places I've worked at Apple from the inside in their culture, Pixar, Nike, they have been doing this for a long time and working in teams and really not viewing people as employees as much as co-creators. And when we build as co-creators, it just becomes, anything becomes possible, and people start to feel really differently about their work. So those are some of the things I'm noticing, and I think what tells us some things about the future.
Thanks for that from both of you. And I think for me, the themes that come up are connection and collaboration. So every organization wants to focus on employee engagement. Employee engagement is an outcome. The process of getting there is the employee experience. So how are we crafting an employee experience? By listening to our employees. So I bring a very unique perspective. I've been working remotely since the end of 2014, so I wasn't trying to figure things out the last few years. And I've worked on, dispersed, distributed teams across the world. We work really well together. We have that connection. We know how to collaborate. So I think if you, just like what Chris said, if you're looking at the top companies, the most impactful companies, they have figured this out. They figured out how to bring people together and focus on the moments that matter to really be able to craft a culture, a work experience where people are connected not only to the organization, but to their teams as well. So I think taking a step back, whether it's hybrid or remote, that's not the question. The question is, what are people's preferences? How do they actually work well? And how do we create that sense of connection? And then how do we find ways to collaborate? I'm very comfortable working remotely. I know that one of my really close friends loves to go into the office a couple of times a week because that's how he actually works best. So I think it's figuring out what works best for the company as well as the employee. And it's not an either or, it's an and. And I mean, the real talk portion of this conversation, I think there's a lot of organizations who've spent significant amount of money on real estate, whether you're, leasing or whether you've actually bought buildings. And so they want people to be in the office. And so is that a real reason? So I think when we connect and when we're physically present, it has to be intentional. It can't just be a, butts and seats mentality. There actually has to be some connection and a meaningful moment there as well.
Such a juicy conversation already. Thank you so much for all of those insights. And what I heard in this was, and Chris, I was also picturing a pendulum as Tracy gave a perspective of sort of like this one side of stagnation and challenges and trouble, and you gave this other side of connection and collaboration. And then Anu, you came in with the path towards, right? And so in the middle of this pendulum is a whole spectrum of how things are, how they can be, the company perspective, the employee perspective. When you think about this transition time, and I think, Chris, like you said, every time is a transition time, right? There's not been a time in history where everybody in every generation says, we're good, and just sort of stops there. But in this transition now, I think we have a lot of very strong feelings about how things should be. And so when you think about it's time to come back to work crowd, which is actually it's time to come back to the office, but we're saying it's time to come back to work, and this sort of like, two sides of the field or opposite ends of the pendulum. No, remote is here to stay. Let's make this functional. Where is the marrying of that? Where do you start on the path towards looking at how to make your company the most functional, the most culturally inclusive, with the most connectedness you can have? Where do you begin?
I think it begins from just it's having conversations with your people. What is it that employees want? Where is it that they actually thrive? And so what does that look like? And that might look very different by team. It might look very different by individual. It could be maybe a specific org within the company. So I think it's really collecting data first before we say this is the best way. So what works it's not a cookie cutter response. It has to be tailored to that specific company. So I think the first part, what I would do is really just focusing on the listening piece of it. What's working, what's not, what are specific individuals, specific teams doing, and then what's the actual outcome? So if they're working hybrid, if they're working remote, if they're all in person, what's the outcome as opposed to just their preference too? So are they actually able to meet business goals and outcomes? That's where I would start.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to start, totally agree, starting with listening and asking people what they think. And I think it's really important that we start with principles. Like, what are the overall principles that will guide the decisions that we'll make about work? Maybe a principle is customer first. Maybe a principle is profitability. Maybe a principle is employee first and respect for employees and flexibility toward employees. Maybe a principle is about our ability to move quickly and respond quickly, right? Like those principles maybe there are 4 or 5 can help guide us. And then I think another very significant best practice as we think about hybrid and remote and who we give choices to about that, who we're able to give choices to about that, has to do with starting with the work. So not, gee whiz, what do you want? And different people are going to want different things. Not, you get different choices based on hierarchy or title, but really starting with the work that needs to be done. And then thirdly, really giving people individual choice as much as possible and being creative about flexibility. Like I think sometimes we can have a mindset that certain jobs have to be in the office all the time, but there may be creative ways to offer flexibility in terms of shared hours or overlapping hours or days of the week. And for us to think about flexibility, not just in terms of the location of work, but the timing of work and the choices that people are able to make in other parts of their lives. I think the other thing that we can do really pragmatically is to have teams really have conversations about how they're going to work differently. So maybe we all decide we're going to be in the office together on Tuesdays at 10 until Wednesdays at 3. And outside of those hours, we all flex, right? Or maybe we decide that we're going to try to do more of our work together collaboratively in the mornings, and then we're going to have more of our time for privacy and contemplative work in the afternoons. I think we can think about the norms of how we share our schedules, because if I'm gonna make the commute, I want to do it on the day that you all are there so that it's worth it, right? So we still need privacy in our schedules, but maybe we are doing more sharing than we used to in terms of who will be where when, so we can connect more effectively. So those are the things that I think are helpful, is to think about principles, to think about the work, to think about new norms of how we choose to interact together, and then to be creative about how we think about flexibility as well.
Yeah, I think those themes are all resonate with a lot of people. As Anu said, the kind of brave conversations, starting with the heart. I think people don't want to go back to, say, the old way. They don't want to feel like it's a clinical experience. Most of us have had experiences with doctors that are terrible, right? I mean, we found that AI is doing a better job of like being personal, which is surprising, right? Like, but you could put that same data, guaranteed that people have had these experiences with managers or with the kind of the corporate structure, right? And I think we're seeing the tipping point where people are just wanting a different experience, and what they really want is simple, right? It's what Anu said. It's a conversation, it's a connection, and Tracy also said, about principles, and I think those are things that can guide our future, right? And so the connection, and not just an experience in our minds or just the logos, right? The science of management has been optimized, right? We have too many managers that believe they can just checklist or task their way through, or even senior leadership, right? That has been doing this for so long, and they think that people are just kind of cogs in the system. We've talked a lot about this in HR for a long time, but I think what we're seeing is it's been democratized, right? People are asking these same questions, and generationally, it's not just showing up at a job. It's like they want to shape the culture. And culture used to be a word that was kind of in closed doors in HR. We try to, sell the concept to leadership, but now, leaders are, with the pandemic, but a lot of the existential changes or shifts, there's no other way to do what we need to do or to accomplish without being intentional about culture. And so I think first principles is a big way for, that can guide our future too. And just honoring what are those things that are universal that we share, right? Integrity, compassion, deep empathy, shared wisdom. I think one of the keys for leaders especially is to not show up with all the answers, to lead with questions, right? This is something that Ed Catmull at Pixar, I met with him and we asked him, what's your leadership philosophy? And he said, I lead with questions. And he went on a meditation retreat for 7 days. He was, early days at Pixar, he was firing off answers to everybody. And he said he wasn't empowering anybody, and he was exhausted. And yet we see this in leaders all the time. And imagine how exhausted the people are who are just taking orders. And this goes on even in companies that are well-known brands. And sometimes people leave those companies, and it's like they're like rescue dogs. They're like, what do I? They just went through some real challenges because they were hired on the premise that they have this potential and talent and they are valued. And then suddenly they're being treated like they're only worth what they're producing, today or this quarter. And it's a shock to the system. And so I think for us to have an awareness of, and this is where I think things like meditation and just being rooted or grounded in natural principles and how the ecosystem of life works is the humanity of who people truly are. The other, well, we talked about this earlier, but was authenticity being that that big word from last year. Is like everybody's thinking about this. Well, I think if we tap into that through empathy, through principles, and through shared wisdom, we can start to build the cultures, with the building blocks that people really want, right? And that leaders ask themselves and really mean it when they say, you know what, I care what they feel, what people feel, and I want to unleash their creativity. The other thing, Tracy mentioned, there's so much power in that, and that has been so untapped. Like it's like I think comparable with our brain, the use of our brain. We use maybe 10%. There's so much like conscious or subconscious. We have untapped that whole creative realm for teams, and so I think people want to be part of creative teams and brain trusts in building things that have never been done before. And so if they find themselves wanting that, and that's their desire, and they want to feel that flow, that shared flow, and then they're just brought into these meetings with a manager who's just grilling them about what they did today or yesterday or last week, that's just a major disconnect. So I think for leading that future, it's going to be unleashing their potential, and building those the connective tissue and painting big dots to give them the permission to do it.
Thank you. So when we think about where we are right now as HR professionals working from a place where there's opportunity to be strategic and also an overwhelming amount of change, when our leaders are coming to us and saying, what should we do, right? Whether they're coming to us from a place of vulnerability or a place of panic or a place of nobody wants to work anymore. There are all different perspectives that they may be coming from. Let's talk a little bit about practical application. So, a couple of you talked a little bit about sort of the fatigue of soliciting feedback, and there are good ways to solicit feedback and not so good ways to solicit feedback. If you were coming into X company right now, any company right now, and helping them figure out how to figure out increasing a culture of belonging, bringing everybody really into the fold and making them feel included, where would you start advising your executive teams?
I'd start with the principle, and it sounds big, but it's really not. It's actually simple and small. To start is co-creation, right? Is how do we just reframe how we lead as not just, I'm not a manager. I'm not just a leader. I'm a co-creator. And my employees, they're not mine to begin with. And they're not just employees, they're co-creators. Right. So if you have a co-creative team that's building things and shaping the future together, then it just starts to change everything. And so I think just shifting that mindset of our roles, right? Stephen Covey would say the best way to change behavior is to change our perception of our roles. And that's major, right? That is such a shift. And I think if we don't start there, if we stay in, and not to throw it out, right? Being employee, that's going to be there, but I think thinking differently about it will dramatically shift how we treat each other and how we approach our work. I think of some of the best leaders I've ever had. And one in particular, he was very senior, and I'd come to his office thinking, okay, he's just going to dump some orders and I'll be ready to take them and I'll just go and do. And he would actually ask me, what do you, if you were me for the day or for the week or month, like, what would you do about this? And he sincerely was curious. And so I'd start to share what those answers were. And then he would take, kind of what was in the air and start to co-create a solution. And he would let me run with it. And I was always surprised by this. I thought, wow, like, how does he trust me so much? This created a spirit of co-creation. So I brought that to my team, right, to the people I was leading. And those things can just have such an impact on the culture. So I think with leaders, if you want to start somewhere, be a co-creator. That's a good place to start.
Chris, I'm literally smiling because that's one of my favorite things to talk about is culture co-creation. So I love that you brought that up. A lot of the times when we talk about culture, we may hear the phrase culture carrier. So someone else is setting the culture and we are expected to carry it. There's no shared responsibility. There's no skin in the game. And so I love talking about just co-creation and having that mentality and having that approach because we actually are all in this together. It's when you think about how a team operates, it's not just the leader who dictates what we should do and shouldn't do. It's how the team comes together. It's how we all hold each other accountable to how we want to be. So it's not pointing fingers at person A or person B, but as a team, we're committed to A, B, and C. So if we're not actually showing up in that way, then we have a conversation of this is what we agreed to. So how can that look different? So I agree with Chris on just on the approach of co-creation. And when I think about a culture of belonging, so part one is the co-creation. The part two is how are you actually stepping into other people's shoes and taking on different perspectives. So you look at all of the research and we talk about culture of belonging. So we know that they're underrepresented individuals actually are preferring to work from home because the number of microaggressions that they actually experience have far decreased when they're actually working remotely than they're working in the office or in a hybrid mode or model. So knowing these types of things, I think as a leader, when we think about culture shift and cultures of belonging, it's happening on a variety of levels. It's happening at the organizational level. It's also happening at the team level, the peer-to-peer, the interpersonal level, and as well as the individual level. So I think we tackle it all four ways, not one. And then when we look at what are other people's experiences, what might that look like? And so stepping into other people's shoes, because I won't say everyone, but I will say most people have had the experience of being the only in some situation. So even if you don't have the exact experiences, and none of us will of one another, we can actually understand what that might feel like. And if not, we can start to ask questions to educate ourselves. And so, but again, the question then becomes as an individual, what action do I need to take? And then peer to peer, what does that interaction look like for me to learn more about someone else? And then at the team level, what are we all holding ourselves accountable to? So here are commitments. And if we're engaging in behaviors that are leading to those outcomes, fantastic. And if not, how are we having those conversations so everyone feels empowered to bring up those points, and then we actually all come together to actually move forward. So I think that team approach, that co-creation, and also being able to step into other people's perspectives and outside of our own, I think that's going to be the difference makers.
Yeah, stepping into others' perspectives, I think about empathy, and there's all that research on how when people perceive empathy from their leaders and their organizations, they literally are more committed to the organization. They're more likely to be innovative. They're more likely to be productive. They're more likely to feel that they're able to navigate work and life more effectively. So there's some great research on that. I think the other thing I would say in terms of like coaching leaders, where do we start? What do we do? And looking kind of again at the title of our session, focused on belonging and performance and productivity. One thing that we know from the research is that we don't get a sense of belonging just from being with other people. We get a sense of belonging from a shared sense of social identity. And so when leaders can reinforce purpose, when they can reinforce line of sight, how my work affects his work and her work and their work, and finally the customer, those are really, really helpful. When a leader is planfully redundant and is planfully repetitive and reinforcing of that shared purpose, those shared goals, that's a really, really big deal. Another thing I think that leaders can do is make sure that they're defining productivity effectively. Like productivity is different for different roles. Productivity isn't just like how many times we can turn the crank or how many widgets we can address, right? Like there are bigger pictures beyond that level of productivity, where we think about performance, where we think about somebody's alignment to the culture, where we think about their ability to motivate others, where we think about their retention, where we think about the extent to which they're growing and developing and contributing to the organization over time. So I think another thing that leaders can do in this moment, as we're thinking about hybrid and remote work and its connection to productivity and performance, is to make sure that we're defining performance broadly. And you used this language earlier, Anu. It's not just about, people being in their seat, right? It's not just about managing to the whites of people's eyes, but really managing to those outcomes. I think another thing that leaders can do is really help reinforce team members' relationships with each other. It's kind of a misnomer that the best team building happens through social time together. That's great. It's positive for us, but we really, really build bonds in teams when we're working together, when we're rolling up sleeves, when we're crossing swim lanes, when we're, struggling together on a challenge and figuring it out together and appreciating what each of us are bringing to the table. So another really practical thing that team leaders can do is bring people together on things that need to be done, on important goals, on areas where we can roll up sleeves and work together. And then finally, we have some really great research on how important it is that leaders are present and accessible for people. They don't need to be 24/7, right? They don't need to be available at the blink of an eye, but in general, when they're more present, when they're more accessible, when they're more predictable in how they approach people and how they, come across, how they show up, those are all really, really good for building trust. And so it's the relationships that we help people build with each other at the team level, and it's the relationships that leaders are building with people through their presence and accessibility as well. So those are some of the things I think about if I'm going to coach a leader. Those are some of the first things I would talk about with that leader.
Yeah, I would just add to that too that I found some of the even best experiences I've had with teams have been in remote settings. And it's surprising because we would do all those team activities, the in-person things with some of those in-person teams, and it was good, and these are worthwhile activities, but you could also have that powerful connection even in a remote setting. And I think it's one of those kind of surprising realities I think we found in this new world. And who knows? I think the exact answer of what works best for any given company or culture is, as my friend would say, who I ask about, workout regimens, and he's far more advanced than me in that space. And he always says, "Well," I said, "What's my approach here?" He says, "It depends. Depends on what your goals are." And so I think the culture and the organization, it depends. But you can have those experiences that are powerful and deep in remote settings as well. And I just noticed too that one of the comments was, how do you sell it? The idea of a culture of co-creation to execs by HR. And I would just reframe that question as in, you don't sell it. You look as to how you serve and partner to show it, right? So you build a co-creative relationship with leaders. Just start exploring questions that are top of mind for them. I mean, to Tracy's point, performance is something that's on their mind, and it's not going away, right? People report to the street. There's numbers that have to be hit, all these things. But how can you reimagine how we get there, right? I look at a company like Apple. I've been in these meetings, with these senior leaders, Tim Cook or others. They never talk about, on the front end, they never talk about financial results as a goal. What they talk about is building the best products that enrich people's lives. And that is what motivates and inspires people. And then they produce results that are fantastic, right? They innovate, they work as teams. And so I think we can't lose sight of and I think just influencing that. I look at my son. I mean, I coached my son's little league basketball team, and nobody else wanted to do it, so I showed up and I was like, okay, and this was like, everybody else had their teams that they had formed over the years. All these kids knew each other. This was our team was just a throw together. So it was like the island of misfit toys. I'm like, oh boy, they're throwing balls at each other, and it's a mess, right? And I thought, okay. But the other coaches I'd watched during the games, and I was doing this too, was just staring at the scoreboard. And I found our team was losing all the time. We didn't have the talent the other teams had. So we would just lose. And it wasn't helpful that I'm just staring at the scoreboard the whole time. But how often do managers do this, right? Or leaders? We've kind of trained ourselves. That's our default setting in the science of management, is just stare at the scoreboard and then, just coach based on that, right? Oh, the numbers aren't there. The numbers aren't there. Why are you doing this? Well, that wasn't helpful for anything with the coaching of that team. And we lost we were losing all our games. And I shifted my mind, said, you know what? Let's try something different. We're going to focus on building the relationships between all these players and building a team culture, and where we work together. It's more selfless, right? Of course, I'm observing the Warriors, the Golden State Warriors, do what they do. At the time, Steph Curry and team, very selfless, right? This force of how they work together, and it's co-creative. And it changed everything. We actually got to the championship game. The team that we played against, they're very surprised to see us there. Everybody was, and I was surprised. We actually won the championship, believe it or not. But it was because we weren't staring at the score, but we were staring at looking to partner together differently and co-create differently. And I think this is the shift that will, if we're talking about remote, hybrid, or in person, this will fundamentally change how leaders do what they do. And this is true of all the best brands that we talk about or we admire, is they've been doing this very well for many years. And it's opportunistic, because that's when people feel that, they think, wow, they don't get the Sunday night blues. They get the Sunday night like butterflies, right? It's like Christmas Eve, right? It's like, oh, this is going to be awesome. Like tomorrow, I can't wait, right? I mean, what emotion that is. And people want to feel that.
Yeah, let's dig into that question a little bit more. That comment from Amina, which was how to sell the idea of culture co-creation to execs by HR. And let's take this from the perspective of we are HR executives, are the people who are listening or may listen to the replay, HR executives, or emerging executives, and we want to get into the conversation. So if we are working as HR folks to connect the dots between hybrid and remote work and how that can lead to successful business productivity, performance results, a culture of belonging and engagement, and to those results, as each of you pointed out, some of the results can be employee satisfaction, employee engagement, financial results, all of that. Where do you begin? If you are an HR person and you want to begin this conversation with your executive team, what is the how that you each would put into place to initiate that?
When you think about HR strategy, it's always about aligning it to the business strategy. So how do we help the organization achieve X outcome, whatever that might be? So the first conversation is always, to me, what is it that you want to achieve, whether it's an organization or whether it's a specific, department or org within a company? What is it that you want to achieve? And then, what I had shared earlier, employee engagement is the outcome. The employee experience is the process, defining it, creating it to really get to that employee engagement. So I would say the exact same thing for this question too. What's the outcome they're looking to achieve? And then the process of getting there is that culture co-creation. So how can we partner together, and how can we focus on how you're creating the employee experience for your team to get you to that outcome?
Yeah, right on. I think absolutely we start with those business objectives. As HR business people, we start with the business objectives. And then I would go to, as well, a lot of the research on the power of culture to enhance performance, shareholder value, employee satisfaction, retention, because the talent revolution and the shortage of talent is so germane right now. So I would be really clear about how culture is absolutely critical to the outcomes that we want as an organization. And I'd be really clear about the data in terms of that. And then I think we could also be really clear about what it takes to have an effective culture. And there are really kind of 4 things based on the research. One, people value really strong leadership, direction, vision, mission, clarity on goals, clarity on expectations. That is in dynamic tension with involvement and participation and people having a voice. You want both of those things. People want strong leadership and they want to sign up to, go to exciting places together. And they want to know that they're authors of their destiny and owners of their destiny and that they have a voice. And so when we have strategies for developing leaders and clarity around communication, when we have strategies for how we involve people and how we ensure that we're listening, those are really, really important, and how we empower people. Another thing we need, the third thing we need in an effective culture is clarity around process and clarity around how we work through conflict and clarity around roles and responsibilities. And so when we have that in the organization, not only as a starting point, but also ways to continuously improve on those are another critical element of culture. And then in dynamic tension with that is really great ability to adapt and learn and change and respond to customers and competitors in the market and all of the things that are going on. So we need that consistency, but then we also need that adaptability. And so I think we could be, number 1, really clear about the business objectives. Number 2, really clear about how culture matters. And number 3, really clear about how to create an effective culture. And through that process, we're co-creating, right? We're maybe assessing our culture. We're defining in which of those areas we need to improve. We're defining plans to improve in each of those areas. We're prioritizing. So we're not biting all of it off, but we're deciding what are the few most critical elements for us. So that's how I would go about it in terms of thinking about how we bring executives to the fore, how we get their support, and how we essentially are co-creating culture together.
Yeah, I think they're, we look at culture, Steve Jobs, they ask him, what's your favorite product or the best product you ever made? And most people would think he'd say iPhone or, iPod or some variation, but he'd always say the culture. And, I think foremost is influencing, but showing how important the culture is and sharing that intention is really a starting point, because there's a lot of executives, a lot of senior leaders who are talking about culture, but they really want it to be a checkbox, right? They really want to just get through the conversation and kind of get the gold star and feel like that they're, making HR happy, or we're kind of not on their back, right? And, it's not anything against them, because like this is a lot of how they grow up in their careers, right? So we have this whole kind of group of senior leaders who frankly don't get culture, right? If they looked at like, Clayton Christensen wrote about this and how will you measure your life? And he talks about culture in the context of these are decisions that were made 5 to 10 years ago, right? About how we're going to behave, how we're going to show up, what we're going to commit to, but not just the easy, but the really hard things, right? Where we say, wow, that's going to require a lot of sacrifice, to do a certain thing a certain way. And so I think the intentionality of that, and to Tracy's point, to be very clear about what we're going to focus on, right? What is the area of focus, right? As far as priority. And I think those are the things that, going back to first principles, getting clarity about what are those things, having those conversations. I think you can start with that conversation. I think Anu's talked about this, the conversations is, having a brave space where you just, and I think so often in HR, we talk about it and we have this kind of, and sometimes leaders even perceive it. It's like Toby in The Office. It's like, we got to fight to have a seat at the table. You're like, no, you just show up at the table. In fact, leaders, they want you to show up at the table and they want you to be inspiring and, be co-creative. They just don't know. They may not know it yet, but we all want that. And so if you're showing up that way and you're co-creating with them, the culture, right? Tracy said it, or Anu, it's like you're sparking a conversation that they may not, they likely don't have a lot of answers for, but they have probably some things that have worked so far. And what are those principles or those strengths to the culture already? So I'd say like become a student of the culture. Make this an R&D exercise. HR, so often we get so programmatic and we're just throwing things over the fence and best practices of what worked at this company or that. And not to demean that, because I think those are worth exploring. But how often do we get really clear about, hey, this culture has an identity of its own, right? Like a person. And just like when we talk about our future self and what we want that to be, and that's a powerful exercise, meditation. Well, what if we think that way in terms of the culture? What is that future culture? I just watched one of my favorite movies again, Interstellar, right? Matthew McConaughey, they interviewed him around this time, and I think he received an Academy Award after he had been in this movie. And he said at the time, they said, somebody asked him, a young man said, who's your mentor? And he said, me in 10 years. And I didn't understand what he was talking about until I saw that movie. And, it's him in the future, right, showing his past self where to go. And I think future cultures, I think we ask ourselves, what's the identity of this culture? What is core to this culture, right? Apple, it's think different. Well, we realized for them, it was, that's great. We're really good at thinking different, but how do we work different together, right? That's the next level. And, be even more co-creative. And I think for other cultures, it'll be something else. And it may be defining that culture, right? Or building that identity. But I think it's a future-oriented question. And that future orientation should not be limited to a select few of senior leaders, because it won't work if it is. It's got to be broad and shared. And by creating that permission or partnering together. And I think in HR, we can help influence that by starting small, right? And starting with leaders to start to co-create that. And in a simple way is first principles, right? I love that Tracy shared that earlier. It's like, we'll start to explore what those are. I'll tell you one at Apple, we discovered with a leader who ran engineering with 4,000 engineers. They do Face ID, camera, all the cool tech. And we said, what's your philosophy as a leader? And I think just asking people that question is interesting where it goes. And especially people who represent the best of, who are kind of like, they came off the DeLorean from the future, right? And they are representative of where this culture really needs to go. And he was one of these people. And he said, I think of myself as a coach. And we said, well, what's your core principle, right? He said, well, when I show up for the conversations, I have ideas that are like my kids, and I feel like other people have theirs, like their kids. But what matters is if I care as much or more about theirs as I do about mine. And then he said, we talk about bias being a problem. He goes, that we have bias training for that. That's fine. But I think in light of DEI, it's like, where is it going, right? But his point was, he said, I have to be biased towards others' ideas. And that was the principle that we included as one of the first principles of Apple's future culture, was being biased towards others' ideas, which is empathy. And he had created a whole culture that was doing this. And it was incredible, like the magic that was happening in that organization. And so I think exploring first principles with leaders and building on those and shaping the future in that way with teams is really powerful. And then you start to wrestle with those questions, bring that to the team and say, well, what do you think about this? How do we manifest this? How would you manifest, right? Being biased towards others' ideas, towards their ideas. Like, how do you have that empathy? Well, and you just start to have these conversations, and then maybe about priorities too. Well, does this work? Does this fit in this? And those are the kinds of things I think people are eager to have those conversations and to feel like they're having an impact that's broader and deeper.
I wanted to share a quick thought too to what was just shared. It's interesting that sometimes we think of culture as something that we are creating and then it's fixed and we don't have to worry about it again. So let's not take a look at that again for years and years. And so as organizations evolve, so culture has to as well. And it's kind of put on the back burner. Every year we've got our priorities and goals as an organization. So we know where we're headed. are we taking a look at the culture and the employee experience to ensure that that is aligned to where it is that we want to go? So I think when we're talking about culture co-creation, sometimes it's an afterthought or not even a thought at all to actually, but but as we look at organizational goals, that is something that gets looked at every single year. So I think that we have to make this a practice just like we do everything else.
What I loved hearing in all of your responses just now was being, right? We are so trained, I think, early in our HR careers, and I think that's starting to shift, but we're trained in our HR careers to protect the organization, look out for the employees, balance the legal stuff, react, respond. And there is such great opportunity to think about who and how do we want to be as an organization? Who and how do we want to be as HR professionals interacting, building culture, building a sense of belonging, of intention, of manifesting, of just continuing to create and not stagnating and not having some of these one side of the pendulum challenges always be at the forefront of things, but really becoming, right? And coming into a place where we're asking ourselves, who do we want to be? As this company continues to grow and grow up, who do we want to be and how do we want things to be? So we've got just a few minutes left. I'd love to hear your final thoughts on anything that we haven't touched on in terms of making that connection between business success and productivity in a hybrid and remote world and a culture of belonging.
Yeah, I would just say a simple way is just reimagine meetings, right? As brave conversations. I've seen this. We worked with a tech company that, in remote, if you talk about like an offsite remote, this can be like draining, right? It's a long, like this, we were planning an 8-hour session on Zoom. And, but we simplified the whole thing down to 3 exercises. One was a personal story, which was just you break out into groups. There's 20 different people, senior leaders, and they just share personal stories. And they had a storyline on a Miro board, and they had Post-its that kind of had ups and downs. And what you had was people that were talking about, wow, your dad died of cancer. Like, wow, mine did too. Right. And they started to have these conversations that got very deep. This was over a course of 1.5 hours, 2 hours. But after that, they said, we want to keep having these conversations, right? In staff meetings or in one-on-ones. They did a futurespective, which was oriented towards the future and just a lot of what we're talking about. But on the business side too, it's like, wow, like what if we partnered with Tesla, we built this or that? And then, they did a retrospective, and actually it was in reverse. They did a retrospective and a futurespective. But after the 8 hours, they're like, this is incredible. Like, they still wanted to be on the meeting. And I thought, this is amazing. Right. And that's the kind of thing that happens with co-creation and with brave conversations. It's really powerful, and people can feel the difference in the culture. And I think those are the things that it's quite simple. It's just let's reimagine meetings, make them conversations.
I think on that same line around communication, at the beginning of the pandemic, the question was, how do we make this work? It wasn't, can we make this work? But interestingly, right now, it seems like the question is, can we make this work? And then the answer is we can't. And so I think it's changing our attitude and our approach to ask, how can we make this work? Because we did just a couple of years ago. So getting back into, Chris, what you were mentioning earlier is just what are the questions that we're asking? And if we're asking the right questions, and we can actually stay curious. We're not here to evaluate. We want to actually stay open, stay curious, and explore possibilities. So we're reimagining meetings, we're reimagining conversations, and I think that's actually going to get us to better outcomes.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Not can we, but how will we? That's great. The other thing I would just say super briefly is that when we do the right thing for people, we do the right thing for organizations, right? When we create cultures of belonging, when we create cultures of performance, when we create cultures of esteem, when we create cultures of empowerment, those are really good for people, period, end of sentence. Let's do it. but also it delivers results for organizations. So I think it's when we're able to fully meet individual needs and group and organizational needs, then we have societies that flourish and systems that are sustainable. So I think we have to remind ourselves that it's not an either or, it's a both and in terms of that one.
Thank you so much. This has been such a really exciting discussion with so many great thoughts and ideas. And Anu, I really want to compliment this last moment that you brought us, which is how can we? Because we're great in crisis, right? In when COVID began, we had to. So how do we? We have to. And now it's what's our opportunity. And so thank you for all of your participation. Amazing panel as always. And so glad to be with you all, and stay with Hacking HR for the next couple of days as the series continues. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.